Hey everyone, thank you so much for joining me today in this Career Recovery Summit. I have had to re-record this because we had some technical issues with the first ever Toxic Workplace 101. So here we are again. I just wanted to say thank you for everyone who has expressed an interest in the summit. I think a lot of us are going through a lot of uncertainty, especially in regards to our career and where the future of work is heading. A lot of us have started to migrate digitally, and it's just a challenging time. So I thought, what better reason than to get a bunch of expert panel speakers together to talk about their specialty and to discuss the evolution of workplace culture, and specifically in regards to toxic workplace culture, because as I'm sure most of us who have experienced it are familiar with, unfortunately it doesn't necessarily go away. It's still very much an ongoing issue, and if anything, during times of stress, like now with COVID-19 and everything else, it is likely to be increasing. So with that said, I wanted today and for the remainder of the 5 days of the summit to be all about how we can be looking at the workplace culture and evolving it, and doing our part to encourage this positive evolution in workplace culture overall. So with that said, I'm just going to run through a couple of key things to keep in mind for the summit. So I know that some of the topics that we will touch on might be slightly triggering, especially for the people who have experienced this or are currently experiencing this. So if at any point you feel uncomfortable, or that what we're saying has brought up some memories and some discomfort in your mental well-being, please just let us know. We do have a trained trauma therapist on hand. So for anyone who is experiencing that kind of psychological concerns, just let us know and we can put together a 15-minute debrief session, and she'll be able to help you work through that. So we are definitely here. We don't want anyone to feel like they're alone. Just let us know in the comments. So we do have a comments and a Q&A section. So as I briefly touched on in the emails, we are running each panel will run for about 50 minutes, and then we'll have a 10-minute Q&A session. So be thinking of all the questions you could be asking, and you can note them down as we're going, and we'll work through them in the last 10 minutes. And for anyone who does submit a question, you then go into the running to win a prize. These include a handful of books, a mix of self-help and workplace culture related. So that's just a little incentive. And you also get a complimentary strategy session with me. And this is particularly useful for those who are experiencing toxic workplace culture and are looking to transition into a better environment. So you can find out all about that on the panel website as well, under the perks section. Also under the perks section, although it's not really a perk, it should just be considered the norm, but we do have a separate section for mental health hotlines across the world. So I think we've got one for the UK, America, Australia, and a couple others. So again, if you're experiencing any kind of distress, just reach out and get the help that you need. So with all that said, let's get into the first session, which is Workplace 101. And the rest of the panel sessions will be a conversation between me and the person. So you'll have a two-way panel discussion, whereas because it's just me in this particular instance, I'm using a PowerPoint just to give you something to take on board. So feel free to take screenshots and make the most of this. Let me just pull it up for you. Nope, not that one. Here we go. So that should be up and running. So for those of you who are currently experiencing toxic workplace culture, one of the tricky things is it can be really hard to pin because it's not always as overt as you may see in the movies or as you might have assumed growing up. And I think that there's this kind of outdated notion that, bullying only happens in the schoolyard, and it's always really obvious when someone is making these attacks because they'll be yelling, they'll be, physically violating someone, and it'll just be this really kind of extreme version. But I think that the problem with toxic workplace culture is it's actually quite subversive, and a lot of it happens subtly and behind the scenes. So with that said, I just wanted to clear up some misconceptions about what is and what isn't considered to be a toxic workplace culture, and consider the context around that, and also to understand the impacts that this could be having on you and those around you, and ways to protect yourself. So this is a great overview of everything. So I guess I just wanted to start off by saying that first and foremost, you deserve to feel valued at work. This is a not negotiable. This is absolutely integral to every single element of work. So if for whatever reason you've been made to feel that you're not good enough, you don't deserve to be there, you are not valued for who you are, you haven't received that kind of basic human rights and respect, that's completely unacceptable. And it doesn't matter what reasons they've come up or what they've said to make you feel otherwise, you completely and always will deserve to feel valued at work. So I just like to start off with that, because I think it's very easy to forget when you're having people tell you on a daily basis that you're not good enough for whatever reason. So I'm just going to move myself up here. There we go. So with that said, here we go. Yeah. So are you in a toxic workplace? A lot of terms get thrown around about what is or isn't toxic. So a lot of these you would have heard already, like harassment, bullying, mobbing, sexual assault, verbal abuse, verbal threats, personal attacks, spreading rumors, discrimination of any kind, denigration, distortion, work conflict, offensive behavior, and victimization. So, oh, I've just realized, yeah, there we go. Just checking that everything's up and running still, all good. So I think one of the traps that people get caught up in is looking for very, very specific definitions of something that is quite hard to pin. So I think rather than getting bogged down in the definitions, although they can be a good pointer or a good starting point, it's much better to think about the mood or the environment or how it initially makes you feel. So I think the ultimate giveaway to whether you're in a toxic workplace or not is the mood. So for example, if there's tension in the air and you have that heavy feeling in your chest, and you feel like you're walking on eggshells, always waiting for the next bomb to drop, never knowing what the next attack will be, and you can't quite put your finger on how it all started because it's a mess and you're just holding on by a thread. I think when this happens, that's when you know it really is toxic, because you've essentially internalized this mood and you can't quite say where it began or how it started unraveling, but it's very much taken a toll on your mental and physical well-being. And yeah, that's when it's kind of like a clear red sign that it's time to reconsider how you're dealing with this. So here are some definitions about workplace bullying, and I think it does go in hand. Workplace bullying does go hand in hand with, as we said, mobbing and a whole bunch of other terms. But the essential thing to keep in mind is it has to be repetitive and it has to be prolonged over an extensive amount of time, and it needs to be unwelcome and unreasonable, and it often escalates. And most of all, it decreases your well-being and your safety, and it puts your career at risk in some way. So the key difference between toxic workplace culture and workplace conflict is the imbalance of power. So for example, you can have workplace conflict between a colleague or between someone at the same level as you. Maybe you're disagreeing about a certain project, maybe you have different ideas about how something could have been handled, but you're having that open conversation that works both ways. The flip side is if there is that power dynamic where someone holds a higher position than you and they have that final say, and they can essentially be tyrannical about it and decide on that outcome without it being a two-way conversation, that's when you get these instances of workplace bullying. And that can work both managing up and managing down. So people who are managers could be bullied from their subordinates, and the people who are being managed could be being bullied by the manager. So it's across the board. One of the most common questions I get asked is which industry is the most impacted by workplace bullying or toxic workplace culture, and the sad answer is all of them. There are certain conditions that may increase the chances of that happening, and I'll go into that a bit later, but yeah, it really is across the board, and that's kind of a huge part of the problem. So I like to use this because I think it's a real awakening to the severity and how easily things can get out of hand. So the key thing to keep in mind is that it can escalate, and a lot of people ask me, what does toxic workplace culture have to do with violence against women? And unfortunately, a lot of the symptoms are very similar. So when people think about violence against women, they instantly think of the worst case scenario, the violence, whether that be the attack or the killing or the murder. It's that red zone. But in order for it to get to that stage, there are certain steps that enable it to escalate. And so that's why it's really important to be considering the initial steps before reaching that danger zone. So this is a really great example of how this kind of occurs in a workplace environment. So say, for example, a colleague is just doing some light banter and having a tease, and they may or may not mean much by it, but for whatever reason it really deeply bothered you. So that it kind of starts here, and this is more along the lines of conflict. It could just be something small. It doesn't necessarily mean it's going to get worse over time, but what it does mean is that you have been impacted this, and if it persists, it could be an indication that they are violating your rights. So the other thing to note as well is it doesn't happen in order. Some people might skip these steps. So say, for example, it starts off with gossip, and then they could just jump straight to micromanagement or retaliation in some way. So it's really important to think about the ways the situation might be escalating for you. And if you see this occurring as well, to think about how it could continue to get worse if a solution isn't reached soon enough. So, and the other thing that I didn't mention the first time around, but I really want to mention now is bystanders are also impacted by toxic workplace culture, because that mood that I was describing earlier, it is in the entire environment of the workplace. So even if you're not directly involved with the bullying, but you're witnessing it or hearing it or in the vicinity, you will still be having these negative impacts because of that level of toxicity. So that's something to keep in mind as well for those of you who are lucky enough not to be currently feeling that element of toxicity. Just know that it could still be happening around you. So an important thing to consider is the types of bullying that could occur. So there's the obvious ones like the violence and intimidation. So, verbal threats, verbal abuse, physical violence, and violence to property. So that's one that's often missed. Like say your manager picks up one of your personal items and smashes it because they're mad. That's unacceptable. So yeah, that's kind of what most people assume when they think of this, think of toxic workplace culture. But as I mentioned, it is a lot more subtle and insidious. So person-related bullying is also another issue. So insults, sideways comments, it could be something like, often it's personalized. So it's not really work related, but they've drew in a element of your personality or like an unnecessary dig that just made you feel uncomfortable and made you feel a little bit lesser in any way. Inappropriate jokes, there's a time and place, and if that made you feel uncomfortable, then again, that's not acceptable behavior. Unjustified criticisms, humiliation, spreading gossip, or rumors. So those are bullies often try and bullying behavior often does try and make it personalized. So even if you're at work, but they are bringing in your personal life or elements of who you are, that's another indication that a line has been crossed. And then the other one is work-related bullying. So this is specific to the actual work. So withholding information, that's one of the most, Beyond Blue recently did a report, and I think it was something like 35% of the candidates who participated said that withholding information was one of their biggest frustrations at work. So that's a huge one, and that's essentially when you should be receiving information, but for whatever reason, the person who is delivering that information has held it back from you, and they've either given that information to someone else and essentially increase that power dynamic where they have this information power over you and they can use it to their advantage, and you're left in the dark, not able to do your work properly because they haven't had that two-way conversation. So exclusion, I think this is often neglected as well. If you're being excluded in social gatherings or during lunch events, or excluded from, you know, a CC email conversation that you really are meant to be part of, any kind of exclusion like that is also considered to be a form of bullying. And then unreasonable demands. So, and that kind of ties into shifting goalposts as well. So if it's just physically not possible for you to get it done in that time, and they said you've had to, and they have told you you have to get it done anyway, that's definitely an unreasonable demand. And often with the shifting goalposts, they could say, hey, I expect you to get this done by this time, but then they might give you 10 other things to do and say, and you also have to get all this done in that time as well. And so that can be an example of a shifting goalpost, because it might seem reasonable to begin with, but they'll just kind of keep adding on to it to the point where it's impossible for you to get done. And then micromanagement, that's also a form of bullying, and it's an extreme form of control as well. Removal of responsibilities without consultation. So there is a law that says, and I have to double check this, but apparently if your job title has changed without your permission or without a restructuring of the contract, this is essentially illegal. So when someone removes a responsibility without consulting you, that impacts your contractual agreement. So we will get into this conversation, into the legal side of things more with the legal speaker on Wednesday. But yeah, that'll be really interesting to hear more about. And then finally, unreasonable refusal to leave or have training or a promotion. So say, for example, you've given them 6 months or more and asked for some time off, and they've just flat out denied it, made up some excuse, and you've gone out of your way to make sure you've done all of the correct things, like given them enough notice, you've checked that not everyone's going on leave at the same time, there's no immediate deadlines coming up, but during that period, but they're still saying, no, we need you to work. So that's violating your rights as well. So it's not letting me go. Here we go. So I wanted to talk about the symptoms that can occur from toxic workplace culture. And I think this is the part that gets really quite terrifying, because there are physical and psychological signs that your whole being is being impacted by this. And those are really hard to deny. So I'm just double checking that everything's working. Yep. So some psychological symptoms include cardiovascular disease, chest pain, stomach aches, dizziness, fibromyalgia, obesity, migraines, and headaches. And these are just the ones that are officially listed. However, there are so many others that haven't been officially diagnosed as a symptom of toxic workplace culture. But for example, one of the things that is really common is sleeplessness. So because you're running over all of the ways that you could be tripped up the next day, or you're trying to work out a solution for how to resolve this whole thing, you just can't sleep because you're just essentially exhausted from the situation, and you're trying to find a way around it, and your mind's just running in circles on repeat, trying to figure out the best outcome in a seemingly impossible situation. So sleeplessness should be on this list as well. Other ones are things like grinding your teeth, abnormally amounts of sweating. That's one of them as well. There are so many, but basically just be in tune with yourself and know what you would normally be at, and see those changes within your body and listen to the signals that your body is telling you. I'm not going to go into this now because we have an amazing wellness and well-being specialist who will be speaking later on. So that's one of the topics that we'll cover shortly. The other one is psychological symptoms. So depression, anxiety, chronic stress, social isolation, PTSD, suicidal ideation, and an overall lower quality of life. Yeah, it's a lot. So one of the things that I like to really emphasize is the fact that the longer you stay in the workplace environment, the worse it'll get. So for example, you could feel like you're not really yourself anymore. Maybe you don't have the same energy that you used to. Maybe you were initially a really optimistic and bubbly person, but you just feel yourself becoming more withdrawn and isolated, and you just don't have the same drive to be, enjoying your hobbies and enjoying the things that you would normally. So these are the initial indications that something isn't right and something is changing within you because of this toxic workplace culture. And if that prolongs, it could become depression. So for example, so in that case, a situational depression could become like full-blown depression. And in the case of anxiety, you could be feeling anxious to go to work because of the meeting, or because you have to confront your bully or the perpetrator that day. And that could go from a mild anxiety to paranoia, because you just can't switch off and you don't know where they'll be, when the next attack will be, and it can create this sense of prolonged stress. So it's really worth considering the costs that this toxic workplace is having on your well-being. And if you're listening to this and nodding along and realizing that this situation is really severe for you and wondering how to resolve it, be really aware that this is an urgent issue that shouldn't be put off, because it only gets worse over time, unfortunately. And I actually run a session called Survival Stories, and I essentially get someone who has experienced severe toxic workplace culture to talk about their experience and offer advice to someone else who may be going through this. And the number one advice that I constantly get is don't stick it out. Like, just don't fight it. Because the cost that it has on your well-being simply is not worth the rest of it. So with that said, I'll go into that shortly as well, but I might also just quickly mention the career costs. So, and a lot of this is more to do with the bottom line. So if you are trying to make more of a logical argument to management or HR, it's really important to be speaking on their terms and looking into what it's actually costing the business. I'm not that, that's not my area that I prefer to tap into, but it is worth noting that PwC and Beyond Blue has recently put together, I think it was a year and a half ago or 2 years ago, they have a report saying how it's impacting the bottom line. So you can actually get those numbers, and more workplaces are looking into it. So if you are in more of a management position and you're looking for an incentive to resolve this issue within your team culture sooner, that's a really good way of pushing it. And this will be covered a lot more when we speak to the HR manager, who is also coming up in the next day. So so the cost to your career could be things like, you're making more mistakes, there's a lowered effort, you're just not as satisfied with your work. Presenteeism, that's a huge one. So that essentially means you're sitting at your desk, but you're not being as productive as you normally would be. And of course, absenteeism, because you're taking more sick days, because you are physically sick. And high turnover, reduced career opportunities because other people are getting promoted instead of you due to this whole element, and reputational harm, and of course, all the direct financial costs that are associated with this ongoing issue as well. So with that said, for every dollar that you earn in a toxic workplace, you are losing $3 in healthcare costs. And this stems directly from the PwC report that I mentioned earlier. So essentially, they did a study that said for every dollar that they invested in workplace wellness, they would receive $2 in returns. purely based on presenteeism being more productive. So if we use that same logic, and I'll read it again because it really is that shocking, for every dollar that you earn in a toxic workplace, you are losing $3 in healthcare costs. So for those of you who are wondering if it's worth just sticking it out for a certain period and hoping it's going to get better, yes, it is very case by case, but on the other hand, this is what you're losing in the meantime. So just keep that in mind as well. So a few ways that you can start thinking about how to protect yourself in a toxic workplace. The first one is, I guess the most obvious one, it is to simply just quit. And although this sounds easy in theory, I know that it's not always that simple. One of the things I like to mention in regards to quitting is it is such a deeply rooted societal expectation that those who quit are considered to be failures. And I think this stems from school when, we associated quitting with the losers, and we associated quitting with not being smart enough or good enough, or we would never succeed. So I think we really have to pull back these societal expectations and the pressures that we've placed on ourselves in regards to quitting, and just really consider whether we're sticking something out because of the way society has positioned it to be, or whether we're doing an injustice to ourselves by staying. So I like to remind everyone that quitting is not actually any of these things. It does not mean that they win. I think a lot of people think that if you stick it out and keep fighting the good battle, eventually, you'll be able to overcome the bully and you'll be the winner. And unfortunately, it's not that. It's not as simple as a two-way street, in the sense that often if it is a toxic workplace culture, it's more than one person. It's very deep-rooted, and it shouldn't be you against the world in that way, especially if it's costing your health. And quitting does not make you a failure, and it definitely does not end your career, because there are so many new opportunities, which we'll go into with the recruiter panel session. I'm really looking forward to that. And just know that there are more options out there for you. And I think that quitting overall is liberating, because essentially it means that you're putting down the boundaries that they have tried to cross repeatedly. And you're saying, at the end of the day, my health is worth more than the paycheck, the bullies that had their way with me, and the amount of abuse that I'm receiving on a daily basis. So you're breaking that cycle, defining your worth, and stepping away from everything that's been holding you back. With that said, though, I know especially now with all the job insecurity and instability that's happening, it is not that simple to just quit, especially if you've got a mortgage and a family to look after. I completely understand why that may not be an option for everyone. So here are a few other options that are worth considering as well. Oh, here we go. Other ways to protect yourself are things like, and this is the number one advice I give to someone off the bat, is to keep a detailed record. So this should also be covered with the HR manager, but having a record can essentially be the difference between you holding up in court or holding up in a meeting to explain what's happened to you and being taken seriously, or just being completely swept under the rug. So yeah, that's a number one thing to do if you're currently experiencing toxic workplace culture and need to know how to protect yourself. The other elements are trying to resolve the situation. So there are a lot of ways to deal with this, and we will be discussing that basically in all of the panel discussions. But there are ways to minimize the situation so it doesn't escalate as much, and also try and protect yourself and your well-being. So removing yourself emotionally and mentally from the situation is so important. And there are a whole bunch of ways to do that, and we will be going to that with the wellness speaker. So please sign up to that panel if you haven't already. And the main advice as well is to know that the attacks have absolutely nothing to do with you. So unfortunately, so many of us, I think especially women, we tend to internalize the problem and we wonder what we've done wrong. How did this all start? We feel as though we're to blame in some way and we could be doing better. And we try and mold ourselves to fit into this new problem so we can try and do our best to resolve the situation. We just really feel like there's a way that we can help and that things could be better. And as admirable as that is, at the end of the day, you need to draw that boundary for yourself and draw that line and know that the attacks really do not have anything to do with you. It is such a deep-rooted issue, and that the best thing you can do is to start like removing yourself emotionally and mentally, and protecting yourself in all the ways listed. So that brings me to the next point as well, looking after your well-being. I think when we do experience toxic workplace culture, we go into survival mode, which essentially means that we wake up in the morning and it's hard to convince ourselves to go to work, let alone do anything else. And so the idea of making yourself a spa bath, or doing your nails, or whatever small perks that would otherwise lift your mood sort of go by the wayside, and you tend to reach for the easiest thing, whether that's an extra snack, or whether that's an extra drink after work, whatever it may be. It's so easy to fall into those traps. I certainly did it myself, and I think that now more than ever, it's important to be looking after your well-being. And it's there's a lot about self-love at the moment, and it's become a bit of a buzzword, but I think ignoring the buzzword aspect of it, self-love is hardest to do when you need it the most. And so I really like to remind everyone that if you are struggling in any way, that's when you need to be making sure, now more than ever, you're looking after yourself, just in the small little ways that matter, like drinking extra water, going for a walk, having a chat to your loved ones. All those things really do make a huge difference in the long run. And you can be implementing these little things to support yourself and give yourself the most strength to overcome this. And we cover this in the mental stigma session, I think. And so the other thing is maintaining context of the situation, which is kind of my specialty. So I'll go into that in the next slide. And also remaining professional and looking for other opportunities. So again, I think it's really easy to adopt some of the behaviors that you've been seeing on a daily basis, even if it's subtle, even if you didn't mean to adopt them. You can sometimes end up acting in a similar way, just because you're so used to seeing that it has become the new norm. And I think that's a really dangerous trap to fall into. So wherever possible, just make sure that you're looking after your remaining professional, and trying not to adopt any of those negative behaviors. And the final way to protect yourself is through context. So there's a lot to consider, but one of the best ways to stop internalizing the problem as your own, and to stop essentially being victimized by the situation, is to take a step back and look at the big picture and the overall system around you. And I found this so comforting. And I think it's sometimes easy to get lost in the toxicity of it all and that cycle. So being able to look at the context can be really healing and rewarding. And it gives you a sense of power, because you realize just how small this world that you've been caught up in is. So the first thing to consider with context is what may be motivating this abusive behavior. So this primarily applies to bullying, so one-on-one rather than mobbing. And it can sometimes be helpful to consider what the perpetrator might be experiencing. So maybe they've recently lost a loved one, or maybe they really wanted to have that promotion and it was given to someone else, and they're lashing out and trying to level out their power and their control. Or maybe they just had a really rough childhood, and they haven't learned the right coping mechanisms to deal with this, and this is how they interact with the world. None of this excuses their behavior. It definitely doesn't mean that they have any right to be treating you this way, but it can be helpful to keep this in mind when you are dealing with them, because it essentially gives less weight to their words and their actions when you know what's driving them to behave that way in the first place. And it also reminds you that their behaviors and actions really do have nothing to do with you. They are just projecting their own issues. So I think that's really important to note on the entry level. And then the next level above that is to consider what is currently going on within the company. So a lot of industries may be experiencing hardships. I mean, especially now, we can use hospitality as an example. So maybe there's supply issues and that's impacting the kind of turnover. Maybe they've been completely shut down. Maybe one of their pockets isn't, or one of their subsidiaries isn't doing as well, and they've had to consolidate funds. Maybe they've recently, there could be a whole bunch of reasons, but it's so important to think about what's going on in the company currently that may be inspiring this kind of toxicity to breed and exist in a way that may otherwise not have been possible to happen. Maybe people are getting promoted when they shouldn't be, and there hasn't been enough training on leadership. So it's inspiring more poor management. I'll go into a bit more detail in the next slide, but it's just something for you to consider as a pointer. And then finally, looking at the macro issues that could be impacting your industry. So this could be things like, say retail, for example. Everything's digital now. So the brick and mortar shops that haven't progressed into the online shopping world may be seriously suffering because they haven't been able to adapt to these macro issues. So it's really worth considering the bigger picture of what's happening within your industry and how, and to break that down into what's happening right in front of you in regards to the bullying or abusive behavior. So in saying that, there are a few indicators of what could inspire a toxic workplace culture. And this is again from a Beyond Blue report. I think it was the 2018. You can message me for any of the reports, by the way. I'm more than happy to share them. Yes, one of the key indicators is high pressure. So if you're in an environment that it's extremely high competition and you're expected to deliver, on a certain budget, and it's very targets based and all about the KPIs, that could inspire this kind of competition and sort of like achieving the milestones no matter the cost. So it can feel very cutthroat. High turnover is a great indicator that the environment is toxic because they haven't been able to retain talent. Lack of training. So again, as I mentioned earlier, the people who have been promoted but haven't been trained to lead as a good manager, those could be perpetuating this toxic cycle. Lack of leadership, again, that ties in hand. Changes in management and mergers and acquisitions. So change management is a whole section in itself, but essentially it just means that if the company is going through a major change, say they've just updated all their software and it isn't conducive to different generations and different technical knowledge, that could be causing some tension. Other elements could be maybe your buildings have changed and no one feels, people are no longer comfortable in their positions. Maybe there's a lot of mergers and acquisition going on, which could essentially mean that some jobs may be on the line. Positions that people have grown to be comfortable in and grown to be known for could be at risk of being made redundant. All these elements can add to a toxic workplace culture. And then of course, volatile market. So if that particular industry sector is suffering or not doing as well as it normally could, that amps up the pressure as well. And long hours, it makes it really difficult for you to look after your well-being and protect yourself mentally and physically when the hours keep getting pushed further and further. Rapid growth is another one. So, I mean, they call it growing pains for a reason. If your company doesn't have the right policies, procedures, and teams in place, and they're just rapidly hiring to fill those slots, that can cause a lot of unrest and do a lot of damage to the company as well. And then finally, sector uncertainty. So if that sector, for whatever reason, is no longer going to be relevant, namely probably because of the changes in tech, that can also add to this overall feeling of uncertainty that can amp up the toxicity and that need for control in order to compensate for this kind of uncertainty. So again, this doesn't excuse the reason for toxic workplace culture, but it gives you an idea as to just how deeply rooted the issue is. And it also may give you some thinking points for those who have either previously experienced it or who are currently in an environment that may not necessarily have it, but you might be ticking some of these boxes. So just be wary that it could head to this direction if these elements aren't resolved rapidly. And then, yeah, so a bit about me. Oh, yep, it's basically time. I'm just going to wrap this up because we're almost at the finish line. So I started Culture Cure in September of last year, and essentially, for me, yes, I've experienced my fair share of toxic workplace culture. I think most of us have, but it was less about my own experience, and it was more about the fact that it had become normalized. So I would have conversations with people much older than me, and in great positions, and I'd sort of say, what has your experience with toxic workplace culture been like? And it would always be met with a sort of dismissive tone, like, it's normal to have the occasional bad manager. It's normal to have disagreements with people at work. Don't worry about it. Just keep your head down, work hard, and one day you'll be rewarded. And I think that this is just such an outdated way of thinking about it because, as I've already touched on, we can't wait for this one day for things to get better, especially if it's such a toxic state that could be the difference between you living and ending it. And it really does get to that level of severity. Thankfully, I was not in that mental place personally, but I have met people and I have worked with people who have experienced that level of severity. So I think that's one of the reasons that we need to be taking this seriously, and we need to realize that just because toxic workplace culture has been normalized in this way and been dismissed as just part of the working world, it doesn't mean that it needs to continue being that way, and it certainly doesn't make it okay. So that's essentially the meaning behind Culture Cure. So thanks for watching through all of that. We did have questions in the initial live version, but that's essentially everything. And if you found this helpful and you'd like to know more about Culture Cure, or if you'd like to attend some of the other panel events, you can you can subscribe to each of the panel events that interest you, and you'll be given the live link. And for everyone who shows up to the live link, you'll be able to ask those questions and get those bonus and go into the running to win those bonus gifts. And for all of you who have missed the live, you'll get to watch the replay like now. And if you'd like to know more about Culture Cure, you can find me on my website. I'm pretty sure it's all over the panel page. But essentially, I am dedicated to helping people in toxic workplace culture so we can end this normalization. And I look forward to seeing what all the other amazing panel speakers have to say about the evolution of workplace culture. And I do think that we are living in a time of change, and this change could be positive. I like to be optimistic about this. So I look forward to seeing what more we can learn and to speaking to you all soon. Thanks. Bye.